Kia ora tātou. Thanks for coming back so promptly after lunch, and I think after lunch is the only time really when you can have a panel which is going to spend an hour and 15 minutes talking about food. Ko Joanna Kempkers tōku ingoa, ko te kaiwhakahaeretanga mō te rāwhiti me te tonga o Pārenga Nui a Hau. I'm Joanna Kempkers and I'm the Divisional Manager for South and Southeast Asia at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and really a privilege to be here sitting on a panel at this ATEPS, which has a focus on South and Southeast Asia. I know that most of you will think that we've been focusing on the US because there's been a lot of discussion about the US or about China. But both of those major players, of course, are having a significant impact on our region in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by three illustrious panellists who will give us variously the academic perspective, the government perspective, and then a private sector perspective. So to my far right is Kelly Garton, who is a research fellow at the School of Population Health at Waipapa, Taumata, University of Auckland. She is an expert on how global trade and investment shapes populations' consumption of food and beverages, alcohol and tobacco, and how that global trade and investment can be adjusted to promote health and healthy and sustainable food systems. In the middle of the panel is Phil Houlding. He's the Divisional Manager, Trade Policy and Strategy and Systems at the Ministry for Primary Industries. His team leads for MPI and trade negotiations. He's previously been New Zealand's senior official to UN Food Systems Summit and to the APEC Policy Partnership on Food Security. And then to my immediate right, we have Grant Verry, who's CEO of the Food Innovation Network and Chair of the Asia Pacific Food Innovation Network. He also sits on the board of Singapore's food plant at the Singapore Institute of Technology. So the topic we've got before us today, food security and sustainability, quite frankly, is huge, but it's a critical one in the context of the three major shifts that MFAT has identified in its strategic assessment. They are, of course, from rules to power, from economics to security, and from efficiency to resilience. So that rules to power shift applies equally to trade and food as it does to other products. We've talked a lot about the WTO, but it's not just trade rules per se. There's also environmental rules and standards for food production, which can be undermined by that shift from rules to power. From economics to security, well, we're talking all about food security. So while it might have been more efficient to buy it from elsewhere, now we're seeing the onshoring and friendshoring and countries trying to increase domestic food production. And efficiency to resilience. Probably, I think, when the strategists wrote the strategy, they were thinking about that, or the strategic assessment, they were thinking about that more in terms of environment. But I think we should ask ourselves in the food context how important long-term sustainability might be for food production over efficiency of producing right now. So with that brief scene setter, I'm going to hand over to the panel. As I said, we've got an hour and 15 minutes or so I think we'll give you 15 minutes each, and then that should leave us plenty of time for I should say a maximum of 15 minutes each, which will leave us plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to ask Kelly to go first.
Thank you, Joanna, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. It's just a short walk down the road for me from the School of Population Health in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. Kia ora koutou, ko Kelly Garton, tōku ingoa. I'm originally from Canada. I don't know if you can tell from the accent. And I grew up on the unceded Coast Salish territories, also known as Vancouver, but I now call Aotearoa home. I wanted to talk today about the new cooperation chapter on sustainable food systems in the New Zealand-EU Free Trade Agreement and the similar chapters that were then developed between the EU and Chile, and as well as the agreement in progress between the EU and Australia in their negotiations. I think the emergence of these chapters is a really important innovation and a significant step forward in terms of how the health of people and planet is integrated in international economic policy. This is the first time that healthy and sustainable diets have been recognized as a common goal between these parties, and I hope that there will be a diffusion of this innovative chapter to future agreements between other nations, and then potentially in future updates to the agreements that we already have. But again, so coming from my position in health, I really want to challenge us today to think about sustainable food systems holistically, and really remembering that the health of people and planet needs to be central to this. And I appreciated Professor Mika's comments this morning about just the values of trade. That food is not just about the dollar value. It nourishes us. It's about culture. It's how we show love and care. It is really central to our lives. So with that, we'll take a step back and look at what's at stake, why a focus on healthy and sustainable food systems and trade policy is so important. And I will focus my examples on the New Zealand context, but this applies globally. And I'd like to talk about what is still critically missing from the Sustainable Food Systems chapters and what needs to be a focus as the parties move forward toward implementing this new area of cooperation. So we all know Aotearoa, New Zealand, as a nation, relies on international trade and the food system. In the food system, this trade is particularly important for both food security and economic prosperity. But we need to think critically about the way our food systems and trade impact the health of people and planet, again, both at home and abroad. So just a few foundational definitions. According to the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, a sustainable food system is one that ensures food security and nutrition for all, while safeguarding the economic, social, and environmental bases to generate food security and nutrition for future generations. And the International Food Policy Research Institute adds that a holistic approach to sustainable food systems recognizes the interplay between dietary patterns, food environments, food production, policies, and broader societal and environmental factors. And optimal dietary intake involves consuming adequate quantities of foods from diverse groups and avoiding overconsumption of unhealthy foods. So it's vital that an approach to sustainable food systems promotes access to and consumption of healthy, nutritious, and environmentally sustainable foods, while simultaneously addressing the systemic drivers of overconsumption of unhealthy and environmentally unsustainable foods. So coming back to our home context, it's important to keep in mind that we as a population do struggle with high rates of diseases related to poor diets. We have the second highest rate of childhood obesity in the OECD at 12.5%. More than half of our children under 5 have tooth decay, and this is largely attributed to high sugar diets, particularly sugary drinks. 1 in 3 adults, about 1.5 million people in New Zealand, are living with obesity, and another third are overweight. And about 6% of adults in New Zealand have diabetes, but the rates are increasing, particularly among young people. Heart disease is the leading cause of death here, with causing 1 in 3 deaths. And a New Zealander dies from heart disease every 90 minutes. And one of the main risk factors for this is unhealthy diet. The burden of these conditions is, of course, significantly higher in population subgroups that have been historically underserved by our health systems and our institutions. At the same time, hunger and food insecurity threatens a large segment of the population, and this is particularly concerning among children. So the latest New Zealand Health Survey released just this week revealed that 1 in 4 children in New Zealand live in households where food runs out, and this is up from 1 in 5 children last year. But poor nutrition isn't just a problem for low-income people. More than 90% of children and adults don't get their recommended daily intake of vegetables. Our research has found that over 50% of packaged foods products in our supermarkets are unhealthy from a nutritional perspective, and almost 70% of our packaged food supply is ultra-processed. And these products now make up about half of our diets in terms of energy intake. And on the flip side, the foods that are harmful to our health are also typically damaging to the environment, and high levels of industrial processing is an important link here. Foods that are highly processed tend to be energy dense, deceivingly high in salt, sugars and or saturated and trans fats, which contribute significantly to the risk of unhealthy weight, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and several cancers. And there's also strong evidence coming out that overconsumption of highly processed food and drinks is linked to poor mental health outcomes. Ultra-processed food is also highly energy intensive and dependent on fossil fuels, especially because of the sector's heavy use of plastic packaging. Major corporations like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Nestle are consistently among the world's biggest plastic polluters of land and marine ecosystems. So for example, Coca-Cola alone used nearly 3 million tons of virgin fossil fuel-based plastic in 2022. And the manufacturing of highly processed foods also relies heavily on large-scale commodity crop production, soy and palm oil being big ones here, intensive meat and dairy production, and destructive fishing methods, which are some of the leading drivers of climate breakdown, biodiversity loss, pressure on water resources, and soil degradation globally. So what does all this have to do with trade? Overall, the global evidence base shows that trade liberalization and associated economic policies correlate with a disproportionate increase in imports and consumption of the types of products that increase our risk of chronic disease, like edible oils, meats, processed foods, and sugary drinks. And what I'm seeing in my research, though it's still preliminary analysis, is that food and drink imports into New Zealand are getting unhealthier and more ultra-processed over time. So over the past 35 years, since before the inception of the WTO, the proportion of our food and drink imports that is heavily processed and high in salt, fat, and sugars has been steadily increasing. And for things like sweetened drinks, snack foods, ice cream, and artificial food additives, the volumes coming in per person per year are going up at an alarming rate. Highly processed foods, high in salt, fat, and sugars, are cheap to produce, transport, they have long shelf lives, so they're often the most affordable option available, and that's one of the reasons why they're often the choice of people with less resources, and this widens health disparities. And they're also often aggressively marketed because a low unit cost, of course, requires high sales volume to turn profits. And then, so fresh, minimally processed food is recommended, but it's more expensive, and the cost of food in general is increasing, making it harder than ever for New Zealanders to have a healthy, balanced diet. It's been suggested that our focus on our agricultural export markets, which, it's been said, produce enough food to feed 40 million people, might be overlooking the nutritional needs of our population. And on top of that, our ability to produce enough fresh and healthy food may be at risk as climate change is expected to bring more extreme weather events, threatening our agricultural sector. Now, our economically important primary industries have made big strides towards better, more environmentally friendly production and processing techniques, and there's a lot of interesting innovation happening there. But this still has a very high environmental footprint, so we have some big challenges to confront in that sector. Looking outwardly, we can do a lot of good for food security and nutrition abroad, but we do need to promote our exports responsibly as well. So for example, New Zealand Dairy supplying a new national school food program in Indonesia, I think will have important benefits to children's food security and nutrition. But some of our important exports, like breast milk substitutes or infant formula and alcohol products, do have health implications. And so while we have a strong interest in removing non-tariff barriers to trade, it's critical that we don't undermine the global codes and recommendations from the World Health Organization to address things like misleading labeling and marketing of these products. So I would argue that our current food system isn't adequately serving the needs of our population, and it does continue to threaten future viability of our land and water. An unintended consequence of our relatively open market is that it's favored the import of cheap, heavily processed and unhealthy foods. And I think the dominant view of food is still that as an economic commodity grown, raised, and harvested primarily for export. So our food system needs rebalancing to make sure that alongside creating wealth, it's also supporting health for all New Zealanders, our trade partners, and the environment. So back to the Sustainable Food Systems chapters. I'm part of an international and interdisciplinary research team that has been analyzing these new cooperation chapters in depth. And we believe that, again, the emergence of these chapters is a huge step forward in integrating the international trade and health policy spheres to really recenter or rebalance planetary health in economic policy in general. So these chapters are about cooperation. What does that mean? It establishes a committee on sustainable food systems that will set out priorities for the cooperation and work plans to implement those priorities. And every year, the committee will come up with an annual work plan of actions with objectives and milestones for each. And there's scope to bring in civil society and other expertise on an ad hoc basis. Now, in terms of content, the New Zealand EU Sustainable Food Systems chapter shows a good amount of convergence or agreement between the partners and how they jointly prioritize several areas of environmental sustainability in food systems, including things like organic and regenerative agriculture, chemical pesticides and fertilizers, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sinks, biodiversity loss, sustainable processing, transport, wholesale, retail, and food services, food loss and waste, Indigenous knowledge, participation and leadership, and healthy and sustainable diets. But from a critical perspective of critical planetary health policy, it still appears that the priorities of the negotiating parties, as reflected in the text, are primarily in promoting certain products and practices that are deemed more sustainable, and not curbing the production, trade, and consumption of products and practices that harm human health and the environment. So the issue of ultra-processed foods is one we need to be particularly aware of, and ensuring the adequate and affordable supply of fresh, minimally processed foods at home. So I think these are innovative chapters that could provide a baseline that further bold policy innovation can be built. But there is this inherent tension with how we address trade in food and beverage products that are harmful to people and planet. New Zealand should be at the vanguard of promoting and evolving the Sustainable Food Systems chapter, not least because our international image depends on it. But this needs to take a holistic approach that includes a focus on health and start to address our uncomfortable problems with overconsumption. It's still early days, so it'll be interesting to see how the rubber hits the road with the chapter with the EU in terms of how we cooperate, but I think there are some really exciting opportunities to align trade cooperation on sustainable food with our health agenda, which would really meaningfully advance healthy and sustainable food systems. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Some challenging things for those in trade policy to think about as we go about promoting New Zealand exports. Over to Phil now.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Phil Houlding. Joanna's already given me my bio, so I won't bother you with it, but just to place me in the context of things that have been talked about today, I had about 15-ish years at MFAT and postings in Jakarta and Washington. So if anyone wants to take this down a Trump reckons kind of conversation, happy to do that. 2 years as trade councillor in Washington as he came in, so I had a bit of PTSD around Deborah's excellent presentation this morning. And then about 6 years at MPI, and technically since our restructure, I don't sort of own much of this stuff, but I haven't asked anyone for permission, so we'll see how we go. I mean, I see the videos on. I mean, we'll be fine. But I wanted to take, and especially backing what Kelly's been saying, I think what we get a lot of in the primary industries and in the in agriculture conversations globally and so forth, the real need to take a systems approach. And That's growing a lot. I mean, even in the 6 years I've been in agriculture and primary industries, that has become a much bigger feature of the conversation. And as you'll see going through this, I'm not sure whether our kind of international and diplomatic structures have kept up with that. And getting the further into this stuff you get, the more political it gets. So much more so than a trade agreement even. You get into real domestic policy formulation, which gets very sensitive very quickly. I just wanted to, before I jump into all the global stuff, give you one quick, slightly esoteric niche snapshot of New Zealand. So this is a study I asked the Ridet Institute at Massey to do for us. They basically take trade figures and nutritional information and try to create a bit of a picture around nutrients for trade. So one of the questions we might ask is whether nutritional security might be another way to think of this problem of food security. Anyway, calcium, iron and vitamin B, basically if you look at the right-hand side, the dark black line is what we should be consuming according to sort of health guidelines. Left-hand side, the first two columns are what we produce and import, so what's actually available to us. Then there's what we export, and then we kind of get what we consume at the end. I love the calcium one. So New Zealand has a shortage in consumption of calcium, which should strike you as counterintuitive. And so, you know, that's just a great example to look at. And I think to Kelly's point, I mean, I'm not making policy pronouncements about how you go about feeding New Zealanders first. I think that's a really big systems conversation for New Zealand to have. But if we are going to have it, it has to be as a system. If you just start putting export bans on dairy products, then you're going to get in a world of pain really quickly. And that has been some of the relatively unsophisticated advocacy around this. But we do need to look at this stuff. So just fully acknowledge that. So look, this is a great panel because it covers the triple challenge of food systems, food security, environmental sustainability and livelihoods, which is for New Zealand certainly the link to trade, trade being critical to us. And I just wanted to refer back to Tane's comments this morning. I see Tane's still here, but there he is, so kia ora. Tane made, in referencing the Prime Minister's comments, I thought what was great about that is Tane's perspective of trade being a potential contributor to these outcomes. I think we collectively as trade professionals need to remember that a trade agreement is not the outcome. Exports aren't even in fact the outcome. It's what they do for New Zealanders in this context anyway. So what can trade do to deliver to these other outcomes? Anyway, in terms of how we're going, make sure I hit the right button here. So this kind of cuts right to the one of the solutions. I'll just leave it there. But we're not going that well, and Kelly outlined some of that. In the production side, you know, we produce enough food to feed the world, we being globally, significantly more than we need actually. But we produce the wrong types of food from a dietary perspective. So we overproduce sugar, overproduce oils and grains. We underproduce vegetables and protein. And at the same time, we've got 600 million people plus facing chronic food insecurity, probably more than that on a peak basis. We've got more than double that amount who are obese. Then we waste enough food to feed over 1 billion people. So, and then the environmental issues are well canvassed. So I personally think it's a global policy failure that, frankly, kind of disgraceful. This isn't difficult technology that we're talking about. We have all the answers for this, actually. We're just not doing it. So the OECD sort of crunched all the numbers, and you can see the answer there. We need to have this 28% rise in productivity. You could argue whether the 6% reduction associated with greenhouse gases is sufficient or not. I think you can have that conversation. So the nice thing, I think, for New Zealand is that's essentially the productivity gain we have had over the last 30, 35 years. So the challenge is, for those of us who have managed to achieve this in ways that are consistent with our own domestic situations, how can we help the rest of the world develop more quickly to be more productive? And that I'll hopefully get through this and end up in Southeast Asia to talk a bit about that. Obviously, I'm going to say that trade is critical to achieving this outcome. Trade is going to be critical in a climate-affected world to achieve resilience. It's perhaps more so critical to achieve resource efficiency, so that people are producing what they're best at. We're going to need to see trade in technology, and we're going to need to see trade in food for growth for the developing world as well. We can touch on some of the environmental stuff through negotiations, conventional biological diversity, obviously the UN climate negotiations. And I have to say, not just because Vangelis reminded me too, but we need to be not paying people to do dumb stuff for the environment. And, I'm really proud of some of the investments that we as a system are making, MPI in particular, but alongside MFAT colleagues in environmentally harmful subsidies. Not just the negotiations, which could be really challenging, but, we're sending someone to Washington to work in the World Bank's food systems operation. And that is to get right in with governments and work on policy reform that gets you to more efficient, more environmentally friendly, more efficient production without the need for subsidies, or at least subsidies going into the right things, infrastructure development, research, all of those things, rather than paying people to over-fertilise and overproduce and all those other things. Finally, probably the tragedy I think of this in some ways is that, like I said, we have the technology. There's actually lots of low-hanging fruit out there to improve productivity and reduce emissions. I personally am somewhat more geared towards cooperation than negotiation in this area. I think given how sensitive this stuff is for everyone, you need to be in a less kind of zero-sum kind of formulation. Now, negotiations shouldn't be zero-sum if they're going to be good, and New Zealand's quite good at trying to not make them like that. But if you go into countries and you're just trying to tell people to change without finding solutions together, you're not going to get there on this issue. But we are trying to reduce emissions globally, and this is absolute limits of my PowerPoint capability. It took me longer than I care to tell you, but we had this kind of cliche. I actually thought the phrase was "you can't mitigate what you don't measure," because we were talking a lot about this in our international climate change strategy within MPI, and it actually turns out it's this management cliche about managing what you don't measure. But the point being that a lot of countries are so sensitive they don't even talk about climate change and food production in the same sentence or in the same rooms. Mitigation, that is. Plenty of people keen to talk about adaptation, but not about mitigation. But what it turns out when you start going out and measuring people's emissions is you start finding lots and lots of solutions. And typically those solutions are very what we would think of as quite simple ingredients to the food system. Good animal health. You don't want sick animals. They're not very efficient. Great nutrition and feeding, same rules apply. Good cold chain, so you're not wasting food. All of those things that are basically built in after lots and lots of investment in lots of places that we know how to do well. We actually need to find the ways to transfer that technology, make the big investments. And so one of the great tragedies of these huge subsidy programs and environmentally harmful subsidy programs is that money could so much better be invested in developing these systems in the world. I obviously, don't worry, I'm going to explain this. As you can tell, I sort of favour a collaborative approach and a more open approach, but it's not always what we see out there. And in fact, one of the biggest risks facing New Zealand is that this question of sustainability is foisted on us in a way that's very prescriptive and in a way that doesn't suit our production system. So many of you will be aware of this EU deforestation regulation. It's just been delayed for a year. Obviously, New Zealand is aligned with the objective to reduce deforestation internationally. New Zealand itself will have more trees in the next decade than it does now. But what this regulation, at least as written, asked us to do was show GPS data for every animal that went into the supply chain into Europe and then prove that that land it came from hadn't been deforested. You can do that actually, but it costs an enormous amount to do it, and it doesn't actually add to anyone's sustainability outcome anywhere that New Zealand does that. I would compare that to the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability that envisages future recognition for sustainable forestry systems as a better way to take that on. And to just pick up on Kelly's point about the EU Sustainable Food Systems chapter, what's really interesting about that is we were negotiating at the same time as the Australians, and they were ropeable with us that we'd gone with this because the way they saw it was that you will be you're going to be basically buying a definition of sustainability that's a European definition. And by that it means not the subject areas that Kelly rightly identified we've got shared interests in, but the prescriptive process around each one of those things. And that was the problem. And so this slightly comical meme, if you were at the last ATEPS, I think I used it then too, hadn't found this cool thing off the internet. But, you know, we're sitting here going, we know that we're not deforesting. We actually can prove that, but it's actually being able to prove it in a cost-efficient way and maintaining those open markets so that we can have efficiencies around that. And in fact, this is what I've talked about with many industry groups. You know, everyone goes, oh, we know we're good at this, we're good at that, and we've got safe food. But it's what you can actually, how you prove that, what you can prove, and also how willing is the other party to actually receiving your proof of those things, which in this case has been a real challenge. So I'm going to try and draw it all together by making a very unsophisticated jump to Southeast Asia. I've got two sort of competing views of Southeast Asia from New Zealand in a primary sector perspective. So you'll recognise on the left-hand side, for those of you who read what you should, which is MPI's situation outlook for the primary industries, comes out every 6 months, about to come out again. Malaysia, Indonesia and Thailand, all three top 10 markets for New Zealand primary sector, and I think ASEAN as a whole would be probably in the top 2 or 3. Joanna will know rather. And so that's one view, and probably in my 20 years in doing this stuff, that has been the principal view of Southeast Asia. Great market, growing, excellent. And then on the right-hand side is like a kind of old but new version of Southeast Asia. So if you think back to the 60s and 70s, Colombo Plan, developing agriculture in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. This is actually very recent. This is in Laos, and it's installing measurement equipment for greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's kind of the new but the old in a way. And I think really where I'm going to take all of this is that those are two approaches, but I think there's a third one that we're missing, at least in the primary sector. And I want to pick up on Deborah's call for cooperation in general. We've got so many shared interests with Southeast Asia that we're not building on. So we're all major food, not all, but most major food exporters. The trade rules really matter to us. We're challenged by big players acting unilaterally. We're all going to be victims of subsidised production, even though one or two are quite good subsidisers themselves. We actually do have significant cultural affinities and people-to-people links. We've got shared geostrategic objectives, and we've got objectives on sustainability and livelihoods. So, in my opinion, there is an opportunity to reframe these relationships with Southeast Asia away from development partner or market for commodities and into shared interests in food systems more generally. The question is whether they're up for that conversation. And the reality in my world, and the difference between being an MPI person versus an MFAT person, is that the folks who come to meetings, like APEC and others, are not wildly interested all the time in taking back something from the international world to change in the domestic world. So we need to find different ways and build confidence, in fact, actually, because New Zealand has always shown up with this very strong export and trade kind of approach. Just to finish, I got the warning sign. I suppose a slightly provocative shot here to end is really just to reiterate something I actually said already, but I want all of us who are trade practitioners to think really hard about our confidence that we are treating trade and trade policy as a lever, as in my opinion it should be, rather than an outcome in itself. And are we really confident, let's say we are reaching the end of FTAs, that whatever we do next, do we do smaller and smaller ones, or do we think about other things we could do? The only way we're going to know what to do is to be very clear on the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So I'll just leave you with that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Always good not to pay people to do stupid stuff. And good to remember that that trade policy is not an outcome but a lever, and we're all trying to do the best for New Zealanders offshore one way or another. Now to you, Grant.
Thank you, Joanna. Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along. Phil, Kelly, thank you very much. Really interesting. Interesting position for me to sit here, the CEO or co-CEO of New Zealand Food Innovation Network. It's essentially a network of infrastructure, both nationally and internationally, that helps businesses add value to the primary sector. So what I'm going to try to do is, in the 15 minutes, take a little journey, talk from a perspective of growers and industry and manufacturers. And I guess maybe I'll start with that macro view of the changing global environment where you've probably heard this before, so forgive me if I'm covering old ground, but in sense of the perspective of saying the law-based norms are changing. We're sitting there in an environment where there are new drivers and new demands from consumers who are looking to make decisions around that. And where is New Zealand's context in regards to being able to add value if we're moving in a change environment from the last 40 years of rules-based norms and multilateral agreements? And I think to do that, we have to be also mindful of our situation for our export sector in the agribusiness space. 80% of that is from 80% of our exports. Phil, you're probably better at this than I am, but that sits about where it sits. 80% of merchandise exports is 80% of agribusiness. So that's for New Zealand is agribusiness. So it's significant to our economy, and it's significant to our standard of living. And I think when we look at trade and we look at how our producers survive, then we need to be considering what is the future for them in this changing world where there might be some changes around the free trade agreements. Again, not my area of expertise, but certainly want to give a perspective from the industry and the growers' perspective. And I'll give you a little story to demonstrate. So the humble onion, one of the largest growers in New Zealand out of Pukekohe, 200, and don't quote me on the numbers, but 250,000 tonnes approximately produced annually, 50,000 consumed domestically, 200,000 exported, ballpark figures here, and a really good success story. 70% of the market they own in that export space. So huge success from a trade perspective, fresh. However, very concerned they don't have a future. And the reason is that their window of supply, as technologies and other countries start to enhance their own growing capabilities, continues to diminish. So it's a smaller window of opportunity for our products. That's a huge threat for us as an economy for our standard of living. And I really appreciated what Phil said in regards to it's the outcome, not the action, that counts in the trade agreements. So here we are with a grower who's concerned, who sits down in my office, and I put my hand up. We do food processing at our facilities. We take food and we add value to it, and a lot of times that is actually through processing it. There is some confusion around ultra processing and processing. I mean, taking an apple and cleaning it can be seen as processing. So I think there is a relevance that says the market will determine what is required, and it certainly is showing us that the sustainability side of things, the safety, the food safety, the quality, the supply chain, the infrastructures behind our agriculture starts to shape up as being a far stronger point in the negotiations as a value proposition. And I would put it out there, I guess, to say from a grower and industry perspective that says we need to continue and we have to meet the publicly announced doubling of export value. How are we going to do that? If we're sitting in there with a commodity situation where our compound annual growth rate sits approximately around 6% currently, but our value-added food compound annual growth rate sits in the last year at 19% and over the last 10 years at 9%, then there's some perspective we need to have to say what's our best chance of success. The onion grower himself says to me when we're sitting there having a cup of tea, you know, for 10 years I've had this concern around this family farm if we will be able to continue to survive. Interestingly, he still can, and interestingly, he's still growing, which is great. But he also understands that unless they look at the value-added side of things, they're potentially at risk. So for us, how do we then tie in, if we're looking at a global system and back to the macro and says, perhaps there are going to be challenges around the trade negotiations. Perhaps now there's more concern around the resilience and rather than efficiency. And again, I think this is in one of the MFAT reports. Instead of just in time, we're looking at just in case. What is our opportunity as a country? And particularly, what is our opportunity if we look at it and say, we are really creative. We know our number 8 wire mentality is in our DNA. We're very proud of that. There's a history of innovation through time in our country. We know we're extremely good at primary production. We know we're pretty good at our supply chain and our infrastructure. How do we take what we do well, add value to that in the trade environment, and be able to articulate not just the trade, but the value chain? And I think that's a really important piece to consider. How do we look at it and say, if we're a country that has a certain set of values, how does that interact into what the globe needs? And does that talk more around food production systems? Does that talk more around meeting an opportunity to tie in our science and our innovation and our systems and our agriculture together? And then how do we look at it and say, how do we do this at scale? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about a new shift in trade value to get to that space. Is there opportunity for us to look at some of our food production systems, and is there an opportunity to internationalise some of those food production systems? I'll give another story. So we get lots of stories in our network. There's a waste valorisation food production system where we're working on with the humble onion, actually, where essentially the grower grows for the fresh market, 20-30% wastage, which is probably standard in the food production space, essentially goes into low value goods, stock feed or landfill is the reality. And we're talking a ruminant, 3 stomachs, not so good with onions, so health and well-being. And so essentially, how do we look at that and say, here's a food system, and this is a project we've done inside of one of our facilities, where we've taken that waste, extracted new value SKUs out of it. Ironically, value SKUs such as flavouring, such as powderising the biomass, the waste, and essentially add value to the byproduct or the waste stream. How do we look at that and say that's okay? In fact, that's much better than putting it in landfill, and we can actually add some increase the revenue to the farmer's bottom line because his inputs are still the same. But how do we actually then take that a step further and make it a bit more circular? And so the process that we've been working on physically over the last 6 months is to take this waste product. By the way, we import onion powder, and yet we have X amount of tonnes, thousands of tonnes that we throw away. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. So here we are, we take it, we turn it into these new product SKUs. There's still relevant biomass left. They're then putting it into a biodigester. That biodigester then produces natural fertiliser. That leftover gas from that produces energy at the farm gate. So quite a nice system that deals with a waste stream, which helps the viability, the financial viability of the farmer. How do we look at that as a country and say, how do we take these systems and how do we scale these systems as a nation where there's actually value to our partners, particularly in our Southeast Asia market, which are a bunch of island nations, the same as we are, with small land block owners, with the same challenges as growers and producers, probably more, that are just on the survival line and actually allow them to exist and thrive. How do we do it where we can say, can we do it from a perspective that says, does New Zealand have the potential to be a pilot country? We certainly are only a country of 5 million, so we need to export. How do we take it and say, can we pick up a food production system that meets the demands of the markets that we're working to do trade with and internationalise it. Copy and adapt, pick it up, take the science with it, include our education system with it, plug it in a collaborative and partnership approach. And I think I liked very much both of what Kelly and Phil were saying around this. How do we look at it and say, we need better nutrition, we need better protein? How do we take it from a perspective that says we're pretty good at agriculture? Where do we sit in the new world in regards to being able to meet the demands of the globe that are over and above a free trade agreement that reduces tariffs? I think that's the challenge in front of us all that provides us an opportunity to be very impactful and very important on the global stage. That's it from me.
Kia ora, thanks Grant. Great to hear about all the innovative stuff that's happening in the private sector and the Food Innovation Network's role in helping companies to add greater value to their bottom line while becoming more sustainable at the same time. So thanks for that perspective. The floor is open for questions. Okay, we've got one at the back.
Question for Dr. Garton. You've made the point that it's not good that we are producing, exporting and importing unhealthy and unsustainable food. What kind of policies or measures would you like to see to counter that? Thinking of trade, would you like to see tariffs on unhealthy food?
Thanks. Great question. I'm glad you asked. So I think, some of the public health nutrition policies that we come back to over and over around improving our food environments, and one of those things is, around better consumer information on labeling and things like restricting marketing of unhealthy foods and children's exposure to marketing in particular. Some of these things are, they are trade related. So we know labeling is often discussed in TBT committees and so on. So I think it's about finding ways to cooperate on, like, looking at the best way we can do this. Another really important area for cooperation, I think, is in restricting cross-border marketing and digital marketing. So this is something that's been really difficult to restrict, and we actually really need different regions, different countries to cooperate on this. So this would be an area I think that would be interesting to explore.
Okay, we've got one over there. Perhaps while the microphone's making its way over there, I can ask one question and we'll gather up a few together. So I happen to know that there's a food security mission coming to New Zealand from Singapore in the first week of December. I know that because my team is trying to organise it. But does it make sense for a food producing or exporting country like New Zealand to lock ourselves into essential supply agreements, food security agreements with a particular country in the long term? So that's my question, but we'll take the one from the gentleman over there at the same time, and then you can have a go at both of them together.
Yeah. Kia ora koutou. I just want to say thanks for that very fascinating talk. The importance of population health is not lost on me as I drank a can of V during that talk. But I guess my question is that I think it's going back to that slide about thinking about trade and food in terms of nutrients. What sort of role do you sort of see trade policy can play in terms of ensuring that, it's not necessarily about the flows of food, but necessarily making sure that, the world can get its nutrients as we can trade the nutrients that we produce for other nutrients that we produce. Yep.
Okay. Who wants to have a go at the first one?
Actually, I think I can draw both of these things together in some way. We'll see. I mentioned in the discussion, and I think it goes to some of what Kelly was saying, that these are all of these trade questions, I think, in food follow from your domestic settings. Like, would we lock ourselves into a supply deal with Singapore for it? So it's not quite what you asked, but you know what I mean? Well, who's we? Like, I don't own a food producer. The government doesn't direct trade in food, right? So no doubt you could come up with some instrument that did that in some way. But somehow if we're to have that, there needs to be some kind of market-based incentives built into that, at least as the system is at the moment. And to the question, I think it's the same thing, right? Where what I wanted to say, and I didn't say very well, I think it relates to the question, is I was reading this article, the National Institute of Health in the US, talking about how globally you could shift food production to the right set of nutrients, like more protein, less fats and oils, whatever. And they just, it's quite, see a little paragraph in a chart that says, of the 350 million hectares, you could move 50 to this type of production. And like that looks good, but every one of those hectares is contested. Like, it's a massive thing, and you see it even in New Zealand with our relatively open political systems. Shifting land use, it's very difficult. So I'm not entirely sure. Like, I think awareness in terms of nutritional security feels quite important to me. I think we've been, happily, I think, when I was growing up, there was genuine famine and shortage of calories and food and energy, and we're in a whole different space now. And I think about when I was in Indonesia, where people had gone from within one generation from stunting and malnourishment, of which there's still quite a lot, by the way, straight into type 2 diabetes because of carbohydrate consumption. I'm just talking stuff, and I'm not sure where I'm linking this back to the question. All of this stuff starts domestically, I think, is for all of these things. So unless you've got a domestic strategy around nutritional consumption, and, we talked in the margins about, food deserts and stuff that you see in New Zealand, like, trade's not going to get at that stuff. I mean, trade can certainly contribute one way or another to other aspects of that. And if you find, as we did in Indonesia, that their beef consumption was a quarter of what it was in Malaysia, I thought there was a project we could do there. This was around the time that they were imposing import restrictions on beef from everywhere, and we're like, hey, instead of doing that, why don't we work together to raise your consumption of protein and because you were still having this malnourishment. But we've been going out for so long and saying, open your market, open your market, open your market. The Ag Ministry is going, I don't really want to be seen with you because our constituents know that you're a threat. So if New Zealand wants to play in that space, we've got to come into it a bit differently, I think. I'm not sure. I've answered lots of questions, but possibly not the two that were actually asked. I don't know if you're honest. You go.
I don't think I'm going to go there for the first one. Not quite my wheelhouse. But I guess to build on what Phil was saying, the way I see the interactions between trade and health is both in how our trade arrangements impact what's coming in and out of the country, so how it's impacting our food environments, our alcohol, tobacco environments, and so on. But also how it impacts policy space for having public health measures domestically. So there is this interaction there. And, we've seen the TBT committee, for example, as a venue where public health, nutrition labeling proposals are discussed at length. They're delayed, they're watered down. It's about sort of cooperating and deciding collectively that we're not going to use trade forums to water down public health measures. The other thing I think is interesting. So we've looked, and I think we need to consider investment as well. But you can sort of consider the health language in trade agreements as being, we've got this sort of protective language around carve-outs, exceptions, and so on, that we're going to protect the right to regulate. And we've got language that is more neutral, but we're seeing, particularly in the investment sphere, countries like Brazil, Uruguay, even Bangladesh, actually requiring investors to be more responsible if they're going to invest in the country, and that includes looking at things like labor and environmental outcomes as well as health. So I think we could be looking to be more proactive in the trade and investment space around what type of food system and activity we want to see.
I might just add to that as well. I think Kelly's right there. At the end of the day, the government's so we're part of the Asia Pacific Food Innovation Network. That essentially means we partner with other open access food innovation centres that operate under a banner of being an ecosystem intermediary, if you like. We connect the ecosystem to try to deliver outcomes. So many of those sit inside the food associations of those countries. One of those is in Indonesia, and very much, as we're all aware of the school programs and the malnutrition challenges. To answer the nutrition piece specifically, I think it's a huge opportunity. You know, we are good producers of food. How do we focus the opportunity to meet the needs of each of our partner nations, particularly in the Southeast Asia region, that allow us to deliver the right nutrients and the right proteins into market? Now, another example of that is there's a Māori business, Daniel Carson from Ngaitahu, and he is essentially looking at the looming change in legislation to the bobby calf situation, 2 million calves per annum, and an opportunity to turn that into a low-carbon re-envisioning of that sector. So I essentially think sheep and lamb, beef and veal. So, when you start thinking of that you've got a nutrient-dense, protein-rich, consumer-based product that can go into these markets. So I think this is the type of thinking that we need to think about collectively. The last piece I'd say is land use, a critical component. I'd propose that we've probably traditionally grown and grazed crops and sheep and cows that have been what we did. How do we now look at it from a market perspective? What does the market need? Where is the value? Where is the nutrition? What is the high value crop that can come back and then be having a land use discussion with our farmers, our iwi, our regions that says, actually, you know what? We could perhaps, in another real case story, plant papaya, do papaya leaf extraction to fight dengue fever. This is the type of things that we come across every day. How do we connect from a policy through to the regions on the ground to deliver some of these things? I think that's one of our larger challenges, actually. How do we get the interagency collaboration, the cooperation, to be able to look at these big picture challenges that are in front of us, but are equally our opportunity?
More questions from the floor? There's another Joanna. And then Connor behind. So we'll take the two and then answer.
Thank you. I'm unsure if this has kind of already been covered, but just thinking about the nutritional impacts of particularly our lower socioeconomic groups consuming less nutritional foodstuffs, and then I think about kind of our trade profile being in horticulture and kind of those more expensive products that they can't afford. How can we incentivize both people and businesses to produce and consume more nutritional and environmentally sustainable food?
Thank you for that. It was really interesting. My question is for Phil. I've heard a lot recently about New Zealand commodities exports sort of being saturated. I heard the phrase peak cow, which is one of my favourite ones I've heard recently. Is there any thinking going on in MPI or your colleagues more generally about, kind of like Grant was saying, how we can transition away from kind of just simplistic commodities exports towards more value-added commodity exports in the agricultural space?
I think that that question could go to all three panellists actually. But how about anyone want to take a stab at the first?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how we go about incentivizing businesses to produce healthier and more sustainable products other than, I don't know, just making the sort of training, R&D, development of this easier, and whether we can subsidize this, that's outside my wheelhouse as well, at a domestic level. But I just think we need to be, as Phil was saying, we have to be considering this from a systems lens, and it's very cyclical. And so if we can be growing and diversifying our market in healthier and more sustainable products, that will end up being better for consumers and for the environment. So interested to hear what the rest of the panel has to say on that.
There you go, last okay. I think it's actually quite simple. It's unit economics. At the end of the day, the producer needs to be able to make $1. And ideally, he can make more of $1 out of a high value product than a commodity product. And it's not just peak cow, it's peak wild seafood catch. We're right there at the crux of making decisions around how we continue to utilise our land, and how does that decision meet the needs of the market that we're in, and particularly, I think, relevant subject to the new position of what may be ahead of us around some of the changes in trade. So, I think unit economics play the driving force in change.
Thanks.
Something quickly. I also wanted to add that, so we've been talking about like food processing and value adding. I think there's a really important distinction between the value add of food processing and value degradation that is more linked to the ultra processing. So it's actually quite cheap to degrade the value of foods and sell, huge amounts of food that is a very low nutritional value, highly energy dense. So, yeah, it's working on those levers so that we are really concentrating on high value rather than low value food. Thanks.
There's a lot in both of those questions, and there's a speech about each kind of element of them, really. Maybe to come to peak cow and just give that overall kind of land use kind of picture for New Zealand. I think, Frank, is it 2016 was peak cow, and I know peak sheep was in the 80s or early 80s. Yeah. And look, those big changes in system, I mean, the thing that has created peak cow is not that there's no more land you could put cows on, but there's no resource consent you could get to do it because of degraded water quality and other things, right? So, the sector as a whole has been thinking about these things for a while. Kind of like I said in answer to the last question, the decisions are down at a much more micro level. I mean, an individual farmer or farming business will make decisions about how to use their land, but to sort of lift it up to the macro level, I mean, this is where, from a government perspective, I think, and just wanted to pick up your piece about value and commodities, the sector gets enormously wound up by that distinction, and I think rightly to some degree, because there's an enormous amount of value in trading commodities. And let me be kind of clear what I mean by that. So we trade over $2 billion of beef. We export over $2 billion of beef, at least for now, into the US. The vast majority of that is called 90CL trim, chemical lean, 90CL. So it's 90% muscle and 10% fat. And the amount of investment and value creation that's gone into creating a system that can produce that to high standards of health, real reliability, X-ray systems, and analytics to actually prove that there's 90% muscle and 10% fat. Most people go, that's just a commodity beef trade. That's a highly valuable and very technologically savvy kind of trade. And the same will be true of milk powders and whey protein concentrates and isolates and polysaccharides and anhydrous milk fats and all of those things. So we're really careful with that distinction. What we do now and produce at the high standards of quality for exports, very few countries can actually do that. Now, that doesn't mean we can just do more of it, because we're kind of, as you said, at the peak of it. So what are we going to do? Well, we'd say most of that's up to the private sector, constrained by rules and regulations set down by government, which speak to kind of land use change in many ways. Having said that, there are some obvious places to look. Horticulture is one, by far the greatest land use return per hectare. Gold kiwi fruit, it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sheep and beef is in the hundreds of dollars in terms of profit, but a massive capital investment up front. Aquaculture be the same, to Grant's point about wild-caught seafood, aquaculture and the whakatohea example from before. So there are some real options, but I mean, the thing, I think New Zealand's history and success in this area has been about land use change flexibility and farmers and growers and owners using that flexibility to chase the biggest value. And it goes back to the first question, market signals and prices are what take you there. So the question that I'm not qualified to answer is how do you create market signals around exactly the question you asked about consumers and businesses coming together around healthy food consumption? That's probably too complicated for me, and I'm sorry, I just don't have the expertise. But like I say, I think it's a whole of systems question. I think we all agree on that, but it's a very complicated one, and it's going to take a lot of political commitment if we wanted to really have that conversation. So.
If I may just agree with that on the way through, I think the systems piece is so important to this because, Phil's absolutely right. The standard of what we do as a country is of huge value. And I wonder if the question is back to the floor, really, that says, how do we take that as a value proposition and articulate that in our negotiations, that value chain? And that talks a little bit to the bit I didn't answer, Joanna, which was the inbound food mission from Singapore. That intent is about them coming to look at our systems, our sophistication in food production. Food security clearly is not going to happen inside their own nation, and so they will be friendshoring, 100%. Can it be us? Is that our opportunity? If it is, do we need co-investment? Is there room for foreign direct investment instead of in our land but into our systems? These are some of the opportunities that lay in front of us that I feel we have a huge, unique selling point. So I feel we still sit in a very good position. We just need to be purposeful about it, understand what that value proposition is, and tie that in, I feel.
Thanks very much. One final comment from me before we thank our panellists, and it goes a bit to your question, Joanna, and the comments that the panel have been making around price signals for growers. Clearly, the way that you incentivise growers to grow in an environmentally sustainable way or in a more nutritionally beneficial way is by paying them more to do that. How do you secure that higher price? Well, the consumer's got to be willing to pay it. And that comes to, I think, the missing piece of the puzzle, which you can put in one of two ways. It's either education, educating our consumers about what is beneficial for the environment, beneficial and healthy food, or marketing ourselves to our customers offshore to show them that is the value proposition. And that's what this food security mission from Singapore is about, is actually marketing ourselves to our partners to say, look, this is what we can do in New Zealand that can be of real value to you, therefore you'll pay more for it from us than you would from getting the same product from somewhere else. And then we have a mutually supportive and beneficial relationship which provides healthy food, not just for New Zealanders, but for our partner countries offshore as well. To me, this has been a really engaging panel, and certainly the last couple of questions have got the debate going from the three different perspectives from our panellists, wanting to wrest the microphone from each other, which is always a good thing. It just remains for me to ask all of you to thank our panellists in the customary fashion.